want to know which planet was causing your suffering? How about Earth?
Hey everyone, Brainflakes here, back with another Eternal Return video. I did want to go over the 1.7c hotfix that Nimble Neuron applied to the game just yesterday. It does involve some pretty massive changes. This is pretty much the equivalent of the final Season 1.0 change in a hotfix. So basically, this is Nimble Neuron's really first major balance patch for the preseason for 2.0. So to begin, we do have stopping power added back into the game. The reason why I wanted to make this video quickly is because if you remember in my previous video, I did say that Nimble Neuron added a lot more flexibility to sub-augments, and unfortunately they ended that pretty immediately with this change to the Havoc tree. So stopping power being re-added means that you're always going to take stopping power, and you're probably always taking Animal Reaper because Animal Reaper was unnerfed compared to Dismantle Goliath regardless of your character. Open Wounds has been buffed a little bit, but the issue with Open Wounds isn't that the scaling is necessarily bad, but the fact that you don't have like an AP, defense, HP, or amp ratio, and also the fact that the base damage is very, very low. So Open Wounds getting a buff to this degree won't make it better, and if they buff it in a meaningful way, it's essentially going to be Red Spray on a sub-augment, which is not healthy. Carnivore being nerfed is a bit disappointing, but Carnivore being better than the seared steak was probably kind of weird to begin with, so I understand the nerf, but once again, very disappointing that the red tree is simply going to be stopping power plus Animal Reaper or Dismantle Goliath if you're a ranged character to that degree. Moving on, we do have fortification changes. Embolden is being nerfed, very well deserved. This was a very powerful sub-augment even in the previous season, and pretty much for the entirety of its existence if you had a way to proc it. Cavalcade is being buffed. 3.5 meters is a lot shorter of a range, and 5% damage reduction is still quite good, but you have to remember that in the past the range was 5 meters, but also gave you 1.5% per person outside of yourself, I believe. So in a full team fight for this exact same, condition, you were getting upwards of 7.5% damage reduction for a full team, and now you're essentially getting the full value for a squad being around you. And if you have one other teammate with you, you get 0%. So it's still pretty bad. I'm pretty sure you're always taking Embolden and Unwavering Tenacity, or whatever they call it. So they might buff Cavalcade even more. I don't know why they reduced damage reduction for such a difficult effect in a squad scenario, but maybe they're just taking it slow. Tactical skills, Quake is being nerfed. -2 per level is a pretty big deal. You have to remember that I think Quake procs like 50 times total, so the fact you're losing 2 damage per level is really huge because at level 10 you've lost 20 base damage, and 20 base damage times 10 was 200, so adds up pretty quickly. False Oath is being buffed, I believe. 50 less HP consumed, 2 seconds longer, and you're losing upwards of 20 to 30 HP if you're melee versus 10 to 15 for ranged per second. So essentially you're not actually losing any HP here, you're actually gaining HP if you're alive for the entirety of False Oath, regardless of the situation. At the end of the 8 seconds you'll regen 30 more HP. So overall a pretty massive buff. I don't know if this adjusts the damage amplification timing at all, just because if you don't know, False Oath is a ramping damage amp, so we'll see if Nimble Neuron adjusts that as well. But if it is just a flat 2 seconds to the max duration and they don't adjust the ramp time at all, then pretty good change. False Oath is pretty low-key in regards to like being used and its strength, so maybe this will make it better, but having to compete with Blink and a lot of other mobility tac skills is a pretty tall order. Nadine is being kind of buffed. This is a really weird change purely because this is really buffing Crossbow Nadine by a lot. Well, not by a lot, by a pretty minor amount. And then Amp Nadine is being nerfed. I personally didn't think Amp Nadine was that strong, but clearly she was performing extremely, extremely well in Korea. And Crossbow Nadine, I guess no one's playing her because she's really boring and she's only meant for RP farming, so we'll see what happens there. But getting double the wild stacks for eliminating test subjects is huge, and losing 10 to 20% on your Q is also really huge, just because you would farm mastery very quickly, which means that you're doing a lot of damage late game. Nathapon is getting a bit of a buff. I don't know if this is more of a reaver on his passive, but just making him do a bit more on such a pretty unpopular character is decent. I do think his skill ceiling is quite high, obviously because One Circle loves playing this character, but maybe it was fair overall. Leon is getting a very massive nerf. This is his true damage on hit passive, so losing 20 base damage and 5% skill amp is huge. You can often auto like 4 times in one combo with Leon, so you're losing like 80 damage, and if you have a lot of amp, you're losing even more. Like if you have 400 amp, you're losing what? Like 160 damage straight up, and that's true damage, so it actually is very meaningful. Honestly, I'm fine with this. I think in NA and EU, Leon was slept on a lot, but I guess in Korea, especially in preseason, he's performing a little too much, so they're toning him down. Rio is getting a tiny buff, getting 2% more attack power. It's actually, I say tiny buff, but that's actually really big because this does get amped by the basic attack amplification, so you're getting 4% more attack power per auto. That's a lot. That's literally like 3% more damage overall, which adds up very quickly. If you remember Heart's passive, when you put in those 2 points, I think that also totals to be about 14% AP for Heart. So Rio is getting like 20% of that Heart Evo for free, so quite interesting. They're really pushing Rio to be strong, which is concerning because if Rio is as strong as Crosswind Nadine, not sure about that. And then Sword getting -2 seconds cooldown is really big because if you guys don't know, Rio's Longbow W does reduce cooldown by a flat amount, so this makes it a lot more accessible in general to get. Martina is getting a pretty massive buff. 5 stacks literally means you can get this within 3 ult casts, period. You do get a few less from corpses, but this is 3 corpses plus 2. That's still 3 casts total, right? Or that's gonna be 4 casts total, which is, again, really fast because if you looked at her previous record, if you recorded every corpse and then got 1 more from like an objective or just a pair, that's still decreasing your ramp time by a huge amount, and there's no compensation nerfs, so Martina might actually be good. Again, my issue with Martina, I guess not really, people probably wouldn't have known this, but my issue with Martina personally was that there was no reason to play Martina over a character like Crosswind Nadine, because Crosswind Nadine not only has a similar scaling effect for playing the game and, you know, getting her rewards, but Crosswind Nadine also just started the game strong. Martina isn't really that great of a character until she gets broadcast, so the fact they're making her broadcast faster is good for Martina, but I think maybe they'll need to tone her down if she just gets broadcast for free going to the future, so we'll see how that works. Bernice is getting a pretty significant nerf. Buffing his crit, of course, is going to be pretty strong in that regard. And Sissela, I think if this is the only nerf Sissela's getting, I would still place her probably like top 5 mages in the game. We'll see if they nerf her more before the season fully releases, but Sissela's quality of life changes were absolutely massive. Being able to move while casting Q and E and giving movement speed on W was pretty ridiculous, so yeah, I'm pretty sure she's top 5 mage minimum, if not like top 3 or even number 1, but that's just me knee-jerking like my response to it, and also like she was pretty bad for all of season 1, so I guess it's fine if she's good now. Amp Isol is getting a 2% nerf. This is per tick, so overall this adds up to be a pretty good amount. I think it hits like 6 times. I could be wrong, but essentially it's just like a 10% amp overall nerf, which will hurt him a little bit, but probably was more for rounding than an actual nerf. Estelle, her W, I think this is again the like a tick rate based ability. Is this the spray, like the water spray? Because if it is, this is a pretty massive buff, but if it's overall, then it's a pretty decent buff. Amp Estelle is probably more fun to play against and more fun to play than Tank Estelle, so if they buff Amp Estelle, I personally don't mind, because again, I appreciate doing damage to people and taking damage instead of just beating on like a stat stick, so not a bad change in my opinion. 11 is being nerfed very hard. Who is surprised? They gave this character so much damage for no reason and gave her no actual nerfs, and here they are finally compensate nerfing what they should have done earlier. The fact that they had all this ready so fast for 11 makes me feel like they had the changes ready, and they were like, yeah, maybe the best RP farming character in the game won't be broken if we just give her flat buff, so kind of funny. She's going to be way less tanky late game. That's -10 defense for level 20 overall. Pretty crazy. -1% on her passive is pretty big considering that you don't really level passive that quickly, so getting half of your efficiency on passive for most of the game is huge. Her Q losing a lot of scaling and a lot of base damage, 20 base damage, 10% AP, and 3% max HP, or additional HP rather. You have to remember that this is increased by 50%, so if you're playing this correctly, you're actually losing 30 base damage, 15% AP, and like 4.5% additional HP, which is absolutely massive. They're also nerfing the refund they gave her for no reason. 30% is still a good amount refunded, but I still don't know why they gave that to her when she was already very straightforward to play. Her E is being nerfed, probably the best nerf here, making her a little bit less good at ratting in the future, and her ultimate is losing, again, a lot of scaling because, again, you give the best defensive character, rat character in the game, a bunch of free damage, and it turns out they might be a little too strong, especially since if you land her Qs to begin with, she did really good damage, and then they just gave her like twice as much for no reason. That's way easier to hit. So good nerfs overall, don't know why they didn't do it earlier, but it is what it is. Karla is getting a pretty big amp buff. You have to remember that Karla does apply her skill amp very frequently with her W and her autos, so 4.4% is a lot. That's going to be 8% late game if you max it out, and 8% more is going to be a third of a persona. So imagine getting a third of a persona for free later on. It's always going to be great. And Tazia is getting a pretty decent bump. Once again, remember that there's a lot of stacking abilities in this game, so this isn't just a 10 base plus 5% amp scaling. This actually goes up to like 40 base and 20% skill amp, so pretty good. Tazia was nerfed very hard by her mini rework, so anything that helps her is probably better for her in the long run. Hyunwoo is getting, in my opinion, a pretty big nerf. Getting 2% more movement speed does not make up for the fact that your baseline going to be 8% slower. Is that the math? Whatever the math is, he's going to be way slower in exchange for a bit better movement speed on his Q. I guess then we'll know and realize that, once again, a really good rat character and a really good chase character having a lot more free movement speed or something additional for free was probably too good of a buff, so they're getting him a well-deserved nerf in return. Hyejin is still a little too weak for their liking, so her passive, which they freshly buffed, is getting a bigger buff. I don't know if this will encourage Hyejins to level this up faster, but hopefully it does because they buffed it by so much. And then her Q doing plus 15 more base damage is really big because, again, base damage adds up, and this ability is on a, like 1.2 second cooldown if you have CDR and if you land it. So it will add up very quickly. You probably land 5 of these on a tank and then maybe 3 of these on a single target person. 45 damage in that scenario is going to be pretty good. Probably won't break her because we didn't buff her skill amp, but it's very, very close to making her very, very strong. Some small weapon changes. Permafrost is getting kind of a rework. In my opinion, this is a massive buff because now you actually get cap CDR instead of having this odd 5% missing, and CDR at higher percents is way more valuable than CDR at lower percents. If you guys don't know how CDR works, it's just that like the jump or the increase, rather the reduction in cooldown when you're from 25 to 30% is way more than if you, like, comparatively, than if you go from 0% to 5%. So pretty good permafrost buff, just fixing the awkwardness of not being able to cap, especially with the CDR mini rework. Beam Axe is being nerfed further, which is pretty funny considering that I think a lot of Abigail mains are complaining that Beam Axe was being nerfed, and it turns out it's being nerfed even harder. Artemis, which is the Hex Bow as of the preseason patch, has been nerfed by a very tiny amount, making it just a bit weaker because Hex is a very powerful item effect to have. And then Heart will finally be enabled. Her W had a funny bug where if you hit W and then press Totem, it would just keep going, and then you one-shot everything known to mankind. So pretty good nerfs overall, or rather bug fixes overall. So yeah, that'll be it for this video. Hope you guys don't mind the even lower effort. I'm gonna be honest, the preseason is very, very low key. I think it's mainly for competitive gameplay or like more serious gameplay, and since North America doesn't really pop preseason ranked at all, Norms has felt really bad because everything you want to test requires you to, you know, play for 10 minutes before you can test it. And unfortunately, Norms without like serious players and just the overall matchmaking quality is pretty rough. If I do play more gameplay, it'll probably mostly be in ranked, ironically enough, this season, just so I can get better quality stuff going on. Just because I think I've gotten to the point where I can like lab out the macro in Norms, but I'd rather just lab it out in ranked to make sure that it's all working properly. And I might have gotten over my ranked anxiety. Who knows? With all that said, I'll see you guys next time. Have a good night or day wherever you are. I'll talk to you later. Bye bye.